Today we'll look first at where we were in early America through the poetry of the Christian Anne Bradstreet and her poem Here Follow Some Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666. The Puritans respected God's sovereignty and prioritized His word above everything else. That is what got these nonconformists into trouble with the Church of England. Anne Bradstreet's father, a strong believer in free speech, became one of these nonconformists after listening to the famous Puritan ministers Dodd and Hildersham. We know that Anne herself took the scriptures very seriously. She wrote, "In my young years, about 6 or 7, as I take it, I began to make conscience of my ways. In what I knew as sinful, as lying, disobedience to parents, etc., I avoided it. If at any time I was overtaken with the like evils, it was a great trouble. I could not be at rest till by prayer I had confessed it unto God. I also found much comfort in reading the Scriptures, especially those places I thought most concerned my condition." There are those who think this kind of continual self-reflection is unhealthy, including Helen Campbell, the author of the biography I'm citing. But Anne was building a strong habit of spiritual honesty before God. She also wrote of herself, "But as I grew to be about 14 or 15, I found my heart more carnal and sitting loose from God. Vanity and the follies of youth take hold of me. About 16, the Lord laid His hand sore upon me and smote me with the smallpox. When I was in my affliction, I besought the Lord and confessed my pride and vanity." The Puritans, with their knowledge of God's sovereignty, were also very aware, as Proverbs 3:12 tells us, because the Lord disciplines those He loves. So they look to things in their lives that God may have provided to help get them back on the right track. And Bradstreet's honesty and humility before God no doubt contributed to her very happy marriage. Her husband, as you may remember from the last episode, opposed the witch hunts and represented the opposition to them coming from Andover. People complained about the Puritans being overly serious. Arthur Miller criticized the Puritans for not having any novelists, although none existed until the next century. He also criticized them for not celebrating Christmas, although the Dickens-like celebrations that we think of did not happen until the Victorian era 2 centuries later. On Christmas, the Puritans were more concerned about drunken brawling in their streets. That was not glorifying to God. And for them, it is all about God. The Reverend John Cotton had gained a reputation for sermons loaded with literary style. But when he changed and gave a sermon in which he, quote, intended to exhibit Jesus Christ rather than John Cotton, his hearers were astonished, disgusted, end quote, and he heard, quote, not a murmur of applause, end quote. People seemed to like to criticize the Puritan stereotype rather than analyzing what they did right in walking humbly with their God. And Bradstreet enjoyed reading, including history, and she has written some long poems that are her interactions with the history that she read, basically narratives told in poetry. She wasn't expecting these to be published. They weren't contrived to generate any income. By the time her signature poem, Here Follow Some Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666, was written, she had from her father and from her own collection a library of about 800 books, including some rare editions, probably the largest library in the New World. Almost everything went up in smoke when her home in Andover burned down. This event was, of course, the inspiration for her poem, which I was teaching to a class of high school students as the World Trade Center was collapsing in New York City. I was in awe at what God had decreed my students to be reading on that terrible day. It had to be about God, not about the loss, not about the 800 books reduced to ashes. She describes the fire. The flame consumed my dwelling place, and when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust. She was focusing on the source of her blessing with this reference to Job, to whom Satan was allowed to do everything but take his life, and yet Job said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." She continued, "It was his own, it was not mine." Although we can see from the poem that she clearly enjoyed some social things in life, she did not so dramatize her personal loss with blame and bitterness, using allusions to other books about loss, but she continued with the same so-called unhealthy soul muscle memory attitude that we saw in her at 6 or 7 years old. "Then straight I 'gin my heart to chide, and did thy wealth on earth abide?" In humility, she remembered the sacrifice of a much greater than her own, that of the Lord Jesus Christ for us. There were no firemen or fire trucks to rescue her belongings, but she told herself, "Thou hast a house on high, erect, framed by that mighty architect with glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. It's purchased and paid for, too, by him who hath enough to do, a price so vast as is unknown, yet by his gift is made thine own." This poem was so comforting to many of my students on 9/11, including one who had an uncle who worked in Manhattan, who we found out later did not go to work that day. We were not looking at a TV on the wall with endless looping images and empty and speculative commentary, trying to fill in time waiting for more details. We saw a real legacy that God had provided in his decrees from eternity past, showcasing Anne Bradstreet's faithfulness to him in disaster. She only lived about 6 years after this fire. It seems to me as if God was preparing her soul for heaven, as she represents by the final lines. "The world no longer let me love, my hope and treasure lies above." It was her knowledge of and applications from the Bible that got her through this difficult time. For the believer, God has some great legacies to give, like the legacy of Anne Bradstreet to my class on September 11th, 2001. Spiritual Information Wars, God-Given Legacies. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, I hope you'll remember together with me that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord.